I am so thrilled to be the moderator today for this incredible panel that I just really want to jump into, but I do want to say a couple words first in terms of the incredible work that the YWCA is doing around this issue. I am an immigrant. I was born in Bogotá, Colombia, and my parents came over when I was 2. And my father and mother, you know, your immigrant story, right? We've heard it so many times. They worked really hard to put us all through school, first in our families to go to college, to be professionals. And throughout it all, what I saw was an incredible commitment and I think an appreciation for what this country offered throughout the time when my parents were working and putting us through school. And when I talk to my parents today, they just are really sad about where this country is headed. And they continue to be activists, and they continue to speak up for immigrants. And, you know, like every other person who grew up in an immigrant household or first generation, they understood the sacrifices that all immigrants have made. There would be no America without immigrants and without immigration. And so I really want to thank the YWCA, not just for putting on this panel, but for their incredible focus on the state of immigration today. And Catherine and Alejandra were also at the border along with Monica when we went down, I guess it was about a year ago, almost a year ago now, to see the detrimental, just devastating, horrific effect of the administration's policies of separating babies from their parents. And the after effect is still in play today. And I think it's going to be an effect of a lifetime for these children and for these families who have suffered this kind of separation. But it's not just that. The YWCA also focuses on the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable in our society are immigrant women and their children. You know, I think a lot about when I do segments on television, and then afterward I get so much hate on social media, it doesn't bother me. But imagine somebody who has no power, somebody who feels like they have no voice. These are so many immigrants today, because of their status, because of their economic status, because perhaps they don't speak the language, they feel so vulnerable in our society. In a country where we have traditionally welcomed immigrants, the Statue of Liberty says it on the base of the statue, but we're not living that right now. And so thanks to the work that the YWCA is doing to really focus on that, but not just focus on the problem, but they focus on solutions. All of the chapters of the YWCA have an element in them that focuses on immigration, on women, on children, on gender-based violence, and on all of the solutions that we can put forward as advocates. Because one of the things that I've realized in this past 2 years is that we can howl at the moon as much as we want, and we need to continue to do that, don't get me wrong. But there are also things in our power that we can do now. And that is continue to raise our voices, but also go into these communities and do the hard work that needs to be done. Partner with YWCA, partner with immigration, with organizations that focus on immigration like Monica's and the work that Juliet and Archie is doing. And everybody has at their fingertips the power to do something. And I think that is what we owe all of these immigrants and their children who are just coming over here to try to give their families a better life and to frankly contribute to this country as well. And I think that last part is something that has been sorely missing from the debate. And I also come to this not just from a personal standpoint as an immigrant, but I worked in the Clinton administration as a communications director for what was formerly the INS. But when we worked there, we really tried to focus on that immigration was a positive for this country, that it was a contribution to this country. And yes, there were really, really bad, controversial, incredibly complicated issues that faced us every day. But we did it with good faith. We did it in trying to understand that immigrants were here to live a better life, and to help the country become a better country, because that's what immigrants do at the end of the day. So with that, I'm going to give a quick introduction to our amazing panel and to start the conversation because they have such robust, not just immigration backgrounds, but backgrounds on gender-based violence, backgrounds on being advocates, and so we really look forward to hearing from them. Right here we have Monica Ramirez, who is an activist, author, civil rights attorney, and recognized expert on gender equity and workplace sexual violence against farm worker and immigrant women. Monica currently serves as the Gender Justice Campaigns Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance and President of Justice for Migrant Women, which is a national advocacy and technical assistance project representing female farm workers and other low-paid immigrant women who are victims of workplace sexual violence. Monica, thank you for being here. Then we have Juliet Choi, whom I've also known for many years. Thank you for being here, Juliet. Juliet is a partner with the Venn Group, which is a boutique government relations and professional services firm. She served 5 years in the Obama administration as former chief of staff and senior advisor to 2 federal agencies, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you again for being here, Juliet. Then we have Archie Piatti, who's a dedicated advocate for immigrant women and girls, and she has more than a decade of experience in immigration law practice, women's rights, and public advocacy. In her position as Chief of Policy at the Tahuray Justice Center, she spearheads national and local policy, mobilizing diverse bipartisan coalitions to press for laws, regulations, and policies to better protect immigrant women and girls from violence. Thank you for being here. Then we have Elise Surgott, who's the director of the YWCA Greater Harrisburg's Violence Intervention and Prevention Program. As director, Elise leads a team whose mission is to provide critical services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Thank you for being here, Elise. And then last but certainly not least, Jennifer Rosario Garcia is YWCA Greater Harrisburg's legal advocate. She provides civil and criminal accompaniments and advocacy to victims as they access Dauphin County's legal system. Thank you for being here, Jennifer. So let's just dive right into it. I know that all of you focus in some way, shape, or form on gender-based violence, and I want to hear from Monica first because I think one of the things that I have learned throughout my years of work as an advocate is how little is known or how little is talked about until recently, thanks to your work and the work of others, about the violence that domestic workers face, farm workers face, especially women, because so much can be done to them and they won't say anything because of fear. So would love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the YWCA for your leadership on this work and for inviting us to have this conversation. What most people don't realize is that across the country in private homes, there are 2.5 million, almost all women, working to care for our homes and our children and our family members. And there are about 900,000 farm worker women who are working in the packing plants, fields, and nurseries across our nation. And one of the things that both groups of women workers have in common, aside from working in isolation, is that because of the experiences of working in isolation, many of the women workers are immigrants. They also share a commonality of facing high rates of both economic and sexual exploitation. And it is often their immigration status, whether they be here with status or without status, regardless of what their immigration history is, that being here as immigrant workers in the United States makes them vulnerable to all these violations. And because oftentimes they don't speak English, they don't know the legal system, they don't have resources or know who to go to for help, they're very fearful to speak out. But in addition to that, the economic situation that both of them face makes it difficult for them to speak out because they need their jobs. Poverty chains them to their jobs. So farm worker women on average make $11,000 a year, and domestic workers on average make about $22,000 a year. And so when you are living in poverty, as farm worker women and domestic workers do, you need to keep your job, and you often put up with conditions that are extremely difficult, like widespread sexual violence in the workplace, because the options that are being presented are essentially, do we put up with these terrible circumstances and have a way of feeding our families and providing for our relatives, either here in the United States or back home, or do we quit this job and take the risk of being cast out and blacklisted, which often happens, which means they're retaliated against and they're prevented from getting other jobs, and then basically continue to live in a situation of economic stability. These are the decisions that domestic workers and farm workers are making every single day. Do they put up with the bad behavior and terrible conditions that they're working under, like the widespread sexual violence, or do they speak out and take the risk of losing their job, not being paid for the work that they've done, and perhaps never being able to find work in the communities where they're living?
Thanks, Monica. We will talk about what we can possibly do about it and what is in their power in the next round. Juliet, I'm interested in your view from the standpoint of having been in the agencies that actually focus on both legislation and enforcing the laws that are on the books. And you were there under the Obama administration. Tell us about the changes you have seen and what has gone on, and in the differences in how your agencies, when you were there, dealt with gender-based violence and what we are seeing now.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks for everybody who's sharing their time this afternoon for this really important conversation. Whether you're a Hill staffer or an advocate that's part of today's conversation, I think it's really important to provide some historical context with regard to our immigration system. I want to say my mantra today is leadership matters, policies matter, and transparency matters. Mm-hmm. So leadership, policy, and transparency. Today I know some of our discussion will focus on some of the policy efforts I helped to implement during the Obama administration, and some of the policy efforts that are underway under this administration. But to equip you and to facilitate this discussion, I think it's really, really important to try to put more appropriate context to the Central American migration situation. I know the news headlines capture the discussions on a daily basis and call it a crisis, but the reality is, if we could take half a step back, is that the U.S. government has actually dealt with the Central American migration situation for decades. Mm-hmm. Yep. There are conversations in the 1980s as it related to political economic instability. Yep. The 1990s were exacerbated by natural disasters and intensified political instability. And in the 2000s and moving forward, in terms of political and economic volatility, that has continued. But clearly in the last few years, when we talk about policy consequences, intended or unintended, I have to say in a singular word, it's breathtaking. As a proud member of the YWCA board member, I also believe that this immigration conversation is very much a women's, girls conversation that is going to impact this generation, and we are going to feel the impact of that for years to come. According to the United Nations, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, which are also known as the Northern Triangle of Central America, actually are experiencing the top murder rates in the world. But more closely, I want to highlight that as it relates to homicides against women, and this is not captured in the news headlines, El Salvador ranks first as it relates to homicides against women, Guatemala is third, and Honduras is seventh, respectively. Now, the headlines also highlight that what we are witnessing at the border is a new crisis situation. And actually, the facts, which I do want to highlight, will tell us otherwise. Actually, U.S. Customs Border and Protection figures in 2000 and 1986, we actually experienced record high apprehensions in 2000 and 1986 at the numbers of 1.6 million apprehensions at the border. Since 2000, those numbers have steadily decreased all the way through 2017. So over a 17-year period, those border apprehensions decreased to the lowest levels at about 300,000. Now, with policy changes under this administration, what we have seen is that border apprehensions are now drastically increasing. In 2018, there was an uptick, and in 2019, just in 6 months, the total number of apprehensions are at 361,000, and at that pace will exceed total apprehensions of 2018. I think it's also important to look at the demographics, and when we look at this in the context of women, girls, and our humanitarian efforts, that we as Americans, as the U.S. government, has been very, very proud of. The current policy administrations have diminished humanitarian affairs efforts. Just to throw out a couple of numbers, and I see that I'm limited in time here. In 2015, the U.S. government was known to welcome the most number of refugees globally at the rate of 70,000 a year. By the end of the Obama administration and during my term at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, recognizing the moral, ethical, and global leadership role that we play as a U.S. government, we increased those refugee admission ceilings to 110,000. So in just a few years, we went from 70,000 to 110,000. The numbers will speak for themselves. Under the Trump administration in 2018, this administration made the policy decision to reduce refugee admissions to 45,000, which is close to a 60% reduction of refugee admissions. And lately, in 2019, those numbers have been further reduced to 30,000. So I know we'll have more opportunity to talk about policy implications, but as it relates to the Central American migration, it is not a new situation. The U.S. government over the last many decades has always had at its disposal a combination of humanitarian affairs policies and programs, as well as financial aid and assistance. And I do share the question with all of you. Are the policies of this government creating the intended consequences we want to see? I would argue that the new policies are actually creating the new crisis at the border, both on the Mexico side, but also on the U.S. interior. And I hope we have an opportunity to dig into that a little bit more later.
Thank you, Juliet. Archie, from your work at the Tahirih Justice Center, what do you see in terms of the kind of gender-based violence that women see, not just while they're working here, but while they are trying to come here and while they're trying to establish what I think at some point they believe will be a better life for them?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you again to YWCA, not only for inviting me, but for being an organization that stands for ending violence against women, and then also standing against racism. Because I think too often we lose the intersectional nature of violence, and we need to stay focused on that. Then again, adding the layer of focusing us today on immigrants and on the immigration, what we're talking about as a policy crisis, but also historically, we can look at immigrants and as a racially profiled against group in different groups of immigrants at different times in our history. And right now, we're seeing the majority of it against Central Americans as well. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me and the Tahirih Justice Center to be here, and really want to say thank you and big applause to the YWCA for this effort. To answer your question more directly, and picking up on what Juliet was talking about, definitely women who are in other countries around the world are experiencing a vast range of gender-based violence, whether it's intimate partner violence like domestic violence or stalking, whether it's dating violence or human trafficking, whether there's also sexual assault, sexual violence, and then on top of that, other forms of violence like female genital mutilation or cutting, and as well forced marriages and child marriages. So a lot of people around the world, and it's hard to say which countries are more likely to produce which kinds of harm. There are countries that you'd be surprised to find out are actually, there is female genital cutting, for example, and people are fleeing. And so folks are coming to the United States not only because of predictable migration patterns due to conflict and lawlessness in other parts of the world, but also because gender-based violence is an epidemic across humankind around the world. As people try to get to the United States, migrants are then again vulnerable because they have left behind families, they have left behind community. In refugee camps, we know, but also as they're fleeing in cars and trains and planes coming to the United States, that there are so many additional vulnerabilities for sexual assault, for trafficking and other things. So we know that there's vulnerability coming into the U.S., and we heard a little bit about that already. When women and children are in the U.S. and they're living here, no matter how or why they came, they become then again vulnerable. So we know the Me Too movement has shown us that none of us is exempt, right? The statistics are shocking. 15% of all reported violent crime in the United States is intimate partner violence. We know that 20 people per minute are experiencing intimate partner violence. I mean, these numbers are shocking to most of us. And to think then that an immigrant woman, including women who are undocumented, but not limited to them, all immigrant women, in fact face additional vulnerabilities because they may not speak the language that's dominant in the United States. They may not speak, they may not be familiar with systems to be able to get to help and safety. They may not have transportation, work permits, other things that we rely on to be independent, to stand on our own 2 feet. That makes them vulnerable to predation. And frankly, there are a lot of U.S. citizen and green card holding men who target women who are immigrants and also know that they can get away scot-free. Mm-hmm. And they use the woman's immigration status or lack thereof as a tool of violence, as a tool of oppression, as a way of saying, I know you're not going to call 911. I know you're not going to walk out on me. I know you're not going to go to the court and try to apply for a protection order or to try to get custody of these kids. Because if you call 911, you could get deported. And I won't because I'm a U.S. citizen. And recognizing this, it's true, and recognizing this, Congress in the 90s created, in the Violence Against Women Act, created special provisions to protect immigrant women from exactly this kind of manipulation, control, and abuse. What's happening in the recent years, though, talking about current policy, is that this administration has strengthened the tools of abuse and control in the hands of violent abusers when their victims are immigrant women. And how have they done that? Well, I'll focus really quickly on the executive orders that came out in January of 2017. We had already heard rhetoric on the campaign trail that was racist, that was targeting Mexicans, that was talking about immigrants in ways that were frankly not becoming of a leader, but also not appropriate and not fair. After hearing that kind of rhetoric, the executive orders came out. The response was shocking. The climate changed across the country, even when there wasn't an exact policy that had been implemented. The executive orders themselves caused a ripple effect. What it did was really send a message to immigrants, and in particular immigrant women, that you are not safe. A group of national organizations, including Tahrir, a few years ago, in March and April of 2017, did a survey of advocates around the country who work with immigrant women and survivors of violence to ask them if they had seen a change in just those 2 to 3 months. And we saw, out of hundreds, more than 700 advocates responded, we saw a huge increase. 62% reported an increase in the number of immigration-related questions from survivors. One advocate stated, this is a quote, "Survivors are concerned that they will be detained if they make a police report or call 911. A 16-year-old survivor attempted suicide because she was concerned that her offender would report her and her family to ICE. Another advocate said, clients are afraid of calling the police because they believe that they will be deported if they do, especially if their abuser is a U.S. citizen. They think law enforcement will listen to someone who is a citizen of this country more than to an undocumented person." And so these policies, this rhetoric, are not happening in a vacuum. They're not just in the halls of Congress or just in the halls of the White House. These policies are having a very serious effect on immigrant communities, on women across the country, on those of us who need protection from the police and are afraid to call. And the result is that women and children are living in abusive situations for longer periods of time and being victimized even more than they would have been otherwise. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, and I'm happy to answer more questions.
Thank you so much, Archie. Elise, let's turn to you. From your standpoint at the YWCA in Greater Harrisburg, tell us a little bit about the programs that you all have available and have implemented that can give some relief to all of the situations that we have laid out here today for these women.
Sure. So the Y in Harrisburg, so we're located in Dauphin County. Dauphin County is a pretty diverse area. We have, compared to the 6 counties around us, Dauphin has the largest proportion of African Americans, female heads of household, unwed mothers on public assistance, foreign-born persons, and the second largest proportion of Latinos and Asians, all of which are larger than the proportions in the U.S. And or Pennsylvania in general. So we have a really, really diverse community, and what we're noticing, though, is that immigrant survivors aren't reaching out in the rates that they should be. We know we have a huge population that should be reaching out based on the statistics about the number of immigrants that experience gender-based violence. And we're seeing way less than 1% of that population reach out for services, and I think that's the biggest challenge that we face, because we do have a broad array of services that we offer. We offer crisis counseling. We have a shelter. We have transitional housing. We provide medical and legal accompaniments. Jennifer provides accompaniments at PFA court and during prelims. We have a 24-hour hotline that's available. But I think one of the most important things that we can do for immigrant survivors is to link them with other culturally specific immigration services. That's not our expertise. And so, our role is to provide what we know, what we can, and then link them and work collaboratively with other people to provide them those other services.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, from your standpoint in providing legal services, I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that step probably is the one that instills the most fear in a lot of these women, especially because I would assume most of them don't have status. So talk us through a little bit about how you deal with that kind of thing.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's amazing to be here with you guys. Do an incredible job. Unfortunately, yes, fear has been one of the biggest obstacles that I've been trying to get through with my clients. Just even building the trust enough for them to even come forward and seek just any type of help, as counseling, anything. It's been incredibly hard. The first thing that they think of is, do I seek safety, or am I gonna be a mother to my children? Mm-hmm. And to take from what Archie said, is one of the biggest things that I've been encountering is the K-1 visa being used against them, the U visa being used against them. They are being literally preyed upon. I know that it's probably difficult for you guys to understand. They are literally being preyed upon. They are being brought here, telling them that they are loved, that they are going to be living this new life. And then once they get here, they are literally being held hostage. I have a client now that was held against her will for over a year. And it took her almost 8 months being pregnant. She was literally about to give birth to say, I gotta get out of here. I gotta seek help. And it's incredible for me to see. And the lack of resources that we have now, when they turn on the TV, all you see is them being deported, or the children being taken into concentration camps. Imagine you as a mom in that same predicament for 1 second, and you are to be made into do I seek legal status? Do I try to get, become a legal immigrant here, or do I risk my child being taken away from me? That's literally the question they have to answer themselves every day that they wake up. Do I seek safety, or do I become a mom here to my child?
Thank you, Jennifer. Before I burst into tears, let's talk about some of the solutions, because we've laid out the problems and they are seemingly insurmountable. But I am sure that in all of the work that you do, as I have seen in the work that I have done, there is power in advocacy. There is power in taking action. So, Monica, from your standpoint, what have you seen are the best ways to try to move this forward? And it could even be baby steps, because if you really look at the problems that were even just laid out here in the last 20 minutes, you kind of just want to fold up and go home, because you think, how can I make a difference? But that's at the point where we have to actually step up and say no, because if not us, then who? These women have no one else. So Monica, tell us, give us a guideline as to how we can be helpful.
Thank you. And I just want to thank all of the co-panelists, because everything everyone said, and particularly the work that's being done on the ground, it's so critical, and not enough of these stories are being heard in DC. So thank you so much. I have done work across this country, predominantly in the South, and when we talk about the fears that people are presenting, the fear of law enforcement action against them, the fear of having their children taken away, these fears are rooted in reality. This is happening across our country, and it's been happening across our country. So the other thing we have to keep in mind is that the exclusions that currently exist in the law, we're going to talk about some of the policy solutions, but the exclusions that currently exist in the law are rooted in racism. So there isn't a disconnect between the conversation on the current situation facing immigrant women workers in this country and racism. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed over 80 years ago, domestic workers and farm workers were specifically excluded from those bills, and still today don't have the same rights and protections as other workers across this country. So we have allowed, as a nation, for the racism that was essentially the motivation to leave those two groups of workers out of those laws to continue to permeate. And that is why immigrant women workers in our country who work in low-paid positions like domestic work and farm work and other positions are being preyed upon, as we've talked about today. So we can't forget the historical context and the way that racism really played a part in creating a situation in which these women are living through now. So what are the positives and the steps forward? So I have the honor and the privilege of working alongside some of the most incredible leaders in this nation, and they are domestic workers and farm worker women who are creating solutions and remedies to address things and to finally close these gaps. So one way that we are trying to make things better is by organizing ourselves, by educating ourselves about our rights and about the gaps in the law, the resources that are available, the people who can help, like the YWCA chapters and others. That's a positive step forward. The other thing is we're bringing forward the gaps in the laws and presenting recommendations about how the gaps can be fixed so that people don't have to continue to be vulnerable. And specifically, I want to mention too, I know we're going to get into policy recommendations later, but I think with respect to farm worker women and domestic workers, there are two that we have to keep top of mind. One, because domestic workers were excluded from FLISA over 80 years ago, that means that domestic workers are not currently guaranteed a written contract for their terms of work. They're not guaranteed a day off. They're not guaranteed many of the basic minimum provisions that most other workers across this country are currently permitted to have. And so thankfully, through the leadership of Senator Harris and Congresswoman Jayapal, we anticipate that a federal domestic workers Bill of Rights will be introduced that will finally extend some of those basic protections to domestic workers so that they can then have more, not just rights, but also the feeling that they will be supported if they come forward to report some of those violations. And then the other, which affects immigrant women workers in farm work and agriculture and domestic work, but other industries too, is the Be Heard Act, which was introduced on April 9th bicamerally. And the Be Heard Act is the legislation that was introduced to address harassment in all of its forms, including sexual harassment and sexual violence against women workers. And what this bill would do is it would finally extend protections under our anti-discrimination laws to workers who work in places with fewer than 15 workers. Because right now, if you're a domestic worker working in a private home and you're a victim of workplace sexual violence, you have no remedy under our federal law. And if you're a farm worker working on a farm that has fewer than 14 workers and something happens to you, like sexual harassment by a supervisor or a coworker, there's nothing that you can do under our federal law. That's just one thing that the Be Heard Act will do. It certainly provides other important provisions, other protections. Like we talked a lot about people not knowing their rights, not knowing how to access their rights. The Be Heard Act would also allow people to have a longer time to file a complaint because currently under federal law, you have 180 days to make a charge of discrimination with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. If you are an immigrant women worker who is unfamiliar with your rights in this country and who is unfamiliar with our legal system, 180 days, it's 180 days in certain states, 300 in other states if there's a state law provision. If you only have 180 days or 300 days to deal with the trauma from what you've experienced, learn your rights, figure out our legal system, and then find someone who can help you, that's an extraordinarily short amount of time. But the Be Heard Act would extend that time period for filing a complaint from 180 days or 300 days to 4 years, which is consistent with other protections under other employment laws. In addition to that, independent contractors are currently not protected under our anti-harassment laws in this country. They would be protected, as would interns. This is a really important law, and the reason I'm spending so much time on it is because when we talk about economic exploitation, we often separate it from sexual exploitation. But for immigrant workers in this country, immigrant women particularly, economic and sexual exploitation go hand in hand. When we talk about violations of people's rights in this country, particularly immigrant women workers, people aren't experiencing just one harm against them, they're experiencing multiple harms against them. They're not receiving their wages, they're being sprayed with chemicals, they're working under dangerous conditions, they're being sexually violated at work. On and on and on. It's just not one thing. So when we're talking about what the solutions are and how we are taking steps to address these things, it is imperative that we talk about addressing all these issues in a holistic manner, and that we not only think about one or two particular provisions of law that might help people, but what does the entire purview of protections look like? And that's why it's important that every single one of us are in this room, because we're coming at this from different places. Some of us are coming at it as organizers who are around the country trying to educate and help people understand their rights and fight for better rights. Some of us are coming at it as policymakers who are going to help move the ball forward, and others of us are in this room because we provide direct services when people come forward and just need to be able to continue to survive every single day. Every one of us in this room plays a critical role in this, and it's going to be the combination of organizing, education, advocacy, and policy change that's actually going to make things better for immigrant workers in this country, and immigrant women particularly.
Thanks, Monica. Juliet, from your standpoint of having worked in an administration that, again, really did see immigration as a positive to the astonishing numbers that you shared with us in terms of the numbers of refugees, tell us a little bit about what we can do, and do you think that comprehensive immigration reform is still the key to answer that and so many of the other issues that we're facing in terms of immigration?
Thank you for that.
Tiny question.
In 30 seconds. No,
Yes, in 30 seconds. So the short answer is, regardless of what your policy perspective is, our country is in a crisis as it relates to immigration. Our immigration laws are outdated. Our systems are overwhelmed. I have to give a shout out to all the federal workers that are law-abiding and serving our country faithfully day in, day out. Our laws are outdated and our immigration system is broken. Now, in the short term, again, I do want to highlight, as it relates to policy makers and policy making, policies always have unintended consequences, but bad policies have absolutely detrimental impact. For the short term, I would say that under the Obama administration, and I was there so I can speak to it firsthand, creating regional refugee centers in country in Central America is a proven policy tool and program and initiative to help to stem the tide, the migration flow to the border. I think
Are those non-existent today?
those are non-existent today. If anything, I think in the last week or two, I understand DHS is talking about the possibility of creating tent cities outside of the U.S. as well as along the interior of our border. So I will say we have proven programs. You know, they weren't perfect, I'll admit that, but we have proven programs, policies, initiatives that did help to stem the migration flow, including creating regional refugee processing centers and working in partnership with the United Nations. And that's where I go to the notion of transparency and community and stakeholder engagement. I do want to briefly touch upon the I think I'm going to be generous by saying this and saying the unintended consequences of the current and new revised immigration policies, which is that we have now created a new crisis along the border where communities and mayors and nonprofit organizations like the YWCA and other domestic violence shelters and social services agencies are absolutely overwhelmed. And so as an American, I would say that we are in the middle of a public health and public safety crisis along the border in the interior. And how do we best invest our taxpayer dollars as well as the donor dollar to nonprofit organizations? I think a model to look to would be, we are in dire need of a whole of government approach as it relates to the border. We've seen this happen. In addition to my 5 years in the Obama administration, I did spend 5.5 years at the American Red Cross, leading large-scale national disaster relief operations. So when we talk about sheltering, feeding, transporting people, providing medical care, safety, first aid, we have a proven model in our country. And I think we can draw analogies from that and apply that to the interior of our border as a result of some of the unintended consequences of the current administration's immigration policies.
In terms of the work that you have seen, Archie, in your day-to-day stuff, what do you think are some of the short-term solutions to these really devastating problems? And you can also talk about some of the long-term solutions that we should be focused on as well.
Sure, I appreciate that. I'll stay out of the abstract and I'll keep it really concrete. We have a lot of staffers in the room, and I just want to be clear, the Violence Against Women Act is up for reauthorization. As you know, a robust bill that advocates worked on for over a year passed through the House just recently. We need it to pass through the Senate as is. No rollbacks and nothing worse than what we got already. And so that's a big ask, but I don't think it's too much to ask. There are already out there in the world, there are advocates talking about how VAWA is a tool for fraud. Their arguments are completely baseless, and I would be happy to talk to any of you, your bosses, others in your staff, at any time about why I think that's so, but I think it's really important that we make sure that VAWA gets reauthorized. Another piece I would advise to staffers is oversight. There's more of an opportunity on the House side right now, but I do think that as much as you can be asking questions, feeding your bosses questions during hearings, especially when they relate to the Department of Justice or the Department of Homeland Security, there's a lot that we can be asking of people in charge right now to find out what's happening. What are the decisions behind the curtains that are leading to the kinds of problems we're seeing on the ground? One example is that there are huge delays right now at USCIS for processing. Delays have completely grown exponentially and out of control in the last 2 years. And the receipts for cases have not gone up. And so why is that happening? If you follow the money, it would make sense. Yeah. And so I really invite those of you in a position to get more information than even we can on the outside to please help and ask the right questions and find out where the money's going and why policies are leaving survivors in more danger than before.
Thank you. I think that we're almost out of time, and I know that we want to do some policy recommendations, but I just have two last comments to make. The first one is to underscore what Archie said in terms of the power that is just in this room. I mean, a lot of people here are staffers and advocates, and you all have the power to put questions and talking points and recommendations and briefings in your boss's hands that they wouldn't otherwise get. And they read these, I know this firsthand. You know, a lot of times my clients, when they complain that I got a meeting with them with the staffer instead of the member, I often tell them, the staffer's the one who's got the power. So you all do have that power, and please use it. I know you do, but this is such a critical issue that, again, sometimes we think it is so incredibly big that we can't really do anything about it until there's a different person in the White House, and we're working on that in 2020. But we can do something now, and I do see that with the new Congress is doing that and is taking that responsibility seriously. So again, I urge you to do what you can, because you do have the power in your hands to move these messages forward, but not just the messages, but real recommendations to what are the solutions, both shorthand and the short term and long term. And secondly, I just want to thank YWCA yet again, because the work that you are doing now is so critical, because you are literally a safe harbor and a sanctuary now that we are in this crucial time, and frankly a desperate time, I believe, in terms of our communities that are feeling attacked and that are feeling persecuted each and every single day. And even within those communities, the women and the children who are the most vulnerable, the YWCA is really creating a place where they can feel safe and they can feel attended to and they can feel like somebody's actually hearing them, and that is so incredibly important. So I want to give the YWCA a hand of applause. Thank you.